Hello, my name is Shelly Johnson, and I am the State Specialized Agent in Natural Resources at the University of Florida with IFAS Extension. In my role, I coordinate several statewide programs, including the Florida Master Naturalist Program, Youth Naturalist Program, Empower You, and Talk Nature with Me. I'm excited to be attending my first NAI conference and glad to have the opportunity to share with you the results of this project, which was part of my dissertation research conducted at the University of Florida. One thing I care about is this: beautiful native old growth longleaf pine forest. Not only do I like the tall trees and the grasses, but I love knowing that this landscape provides great habitat for all sorts of native wildlife species who are adapted to live here. Gopher tortoise, fox squirrel, bats, quail, and woodpeckers, and many others. And for me, that's enough for this forest to matter. That's enough for me to want it to stay and continue providing the benefits that it does. But everyone comes from different backgrounds, perspectives, and experiences. And for some, this forest might just be a place that is hot and humid, buggy, full of things that bite, sting, and scare. So how do we get others to care about conservation of wildlife habitat? Well, we do already know that some characteristics of species can influence public support. Species which are more closely related to us tend to be more highly valued. For example, mammals and birds are generally favored over reptiles and fish. Species with an appearance that is more human-like are typically considered more likable and charismatic. Think of the WWF panda, teddy bears, and typically most cute and cuddly critters. In addition to physical characteristics, species thought to be endangered or rare typically have more public support. And conversely, species viewed as very common are less valued. Interestingly, it doesn't matter if their perception is correct, but only if they think the animal is rare or common. Lastly, we know the public generally values species they deem as useful, which is typically defined as something humans use directly, but I will challenge this assumption as we move forward. But what about wildlife that aren't perceived as cute, helpless, handy, or charismatic? What about those perceived as mysterious, misunderstood, scary, or slimy? Can we change support for those critters seen as beasts into beauties? Ecologists have long understood that all wildlife provides benefits and that ecosystems and the web of life are intertwined. Removing a species from an ecosystem can impact other species, which may ultimately impact the human way of life. That's a lot to explain to someone who's about to smash a spider if they think that spider is about to bite them, even if it's the last thing the spider really wants to do. So the answer to this question can be answered by using a term that was originally mentioned in the scientific literature starting in about 1997. The definition of ecosystem services is simply the benefits that society receives from the ecosystem. Ecosystem services related to wildlife can include direct uses, in which the person directly interacts with the animal to benefit from it. Direct uses have been, by far, the most commonly recognized reason for conserving wildlife habitat in the past. But there are also indirect uses, where the animal may perform a function which in turn benefits people. And non-uses, which are values that do not require a person to be in contact nor proximity of the animal in order to benefit from them. The tricky thing with using ecosystem services as a reason to conserve wildlife habitat is that unless the potential services are recognized and appreciated by people, they don't actually create a benefit. So it depends whose lens you're looking through. The birders on the right likely value this natural area for recreation. The people in the crowd on the left might not. So identifying how your public values wildlife is essential for communicating with them in order to build support for habitat conservation. This led us to the task of determining how benefits provided by wildlife might influence public support for conservation. Can the public's perception be changed if they better understand the benefits? If you want to play along right now in the chat, you can post, what is your prediction? I'll give you a few seconds before I move to the next slide. This study focused on ecosystem of conservation interest, specifically the native range of the longleaf pine ecosystem in the southeastern United States. This threatened ecosystem has been reduced to fragments covering less than 5% of its original range. It is home to hundreds of plant and animal species, which are specialized to this ecosystem, many of which live nowhere else on Earth. The case study presented here focuses on the native range and residents within the political boundaries of the state of Florida. 10 wildlife species of conservation interest in Florida were included in the survey. We selected them to represent a range of phylogeny, including mammals, birds, and reptiles, and different conservation statuses, including federally threatened and endangered, state threatened, species of conservation concern, hunted species, some relatively unknown species, and some more stable and common populations. Over half are endemic to this ecosystem, meaning they can only be found here. We developed and conducted a mixed methods survey, which was administered online. The survey included 1,241 adults representing the general public of Florida, targeting a proportional representation of ages, ethnicities, and household incomes in all counties which overlap with the native range of the longleaf pine ecosystem in Florida. The respondents were first introduced to the study and each animal by nothing more than its name and a basic black and white drawing of the animal. They were then shown this slide in randomized order and told that resources for habitat improvements are limited, so it is important that we understand the public's priorities for such improvements. They were then instructed to rank the animals in order of priority for habitat improvements for that animal. In the chat, you can post what would be your highest and lowest ranked animals. I'll give you about 10 seconds before I move to the next slide. Study participant results of the wildlife ranking were not too surprising, with the bald eagle being the most highly ranked, given its symbol for the country. And interestingly, in the survey comments, a lot of people mentioned ranking it highly because it is an endangered species, when in fact it was delisted decades ago and actually doing quite well. The second and third ranked species were the charismatic Florida black bear, again, not too surprising, and the gopher tortoise, which in Florida is known to be a threatened species and fairly known by the public as a poster child for longleaf habitat. At the low end of the ranking were, sadly but predictably, the two snake species. The eastern indigo is actually federally threatened, but in reality, most Floridians probably have never heard of it. And of course, the rattlesnake is a typically feared animal by many. Ranked just above the snakes were two lesser understood species, the gopher frog, which is endemic to the longleaf range, and the evening bat, which is fairly common, but in general, bats do fall in that category of being feared by many people. In the middle of the rankings include the Sherman fox squirrel, another endemic species of conservation concern in the longleaf ecosystem. The comments in the survey revealed that respondents saw this animal the same as the small gray squirrels who overpopulate their yards at home. Also, the red cockaded woodpecker, which is the most endangered in this study, but likely was unrealized by most. And lastly, square in the middle, an historic important hunting species in Florida, the bobwhite quail. For the next step of this study, we needed to identify the types of benefits that people recognize as important. To do this, we conducted a focus group asking generally what makes an animal important to you. There was no association made with any particular animal in the question, except to explain the difference between what was meant by wildlife when it became apparent that some participants considered any non-human animal, including their dogs, cats, and goldfish at home, as wildlife. After summarizing the focus group responses, we identified 7 benefits to consider. There were 2 direct uses: hunting for food or sport, and provides recreation and tourism, such as bird watching or even hiking with scenery. 2 indirect uses: animals who support other animals in nature, and animals who help control pests that impact people. And non-uses, including animals who have symbolic importance and animals people desire to have for future generations. This is also known as a bequest value, and animals who make people happy just by knowing they exist, also known as existence value. Those 8 identified benefits are what we used in the next step of our survey, telling our respondents that animals provide different benefits to society, and asking them to reorder the 8 benefits listed from highest to lowest with the prompt, "An animal is important to me if..." In the chat, you can post which benefit would you rank as the highest and lowest. I'll give you about 10 seconds before I move to the next slide. Interestingly, our survey respondents identified the indirect uses of supporting other animals in nature and controlling pests as the highest, while the direct uses of hunting and recreation were lowest ranked, and the non-uses of symbolic, future bequest, and existence value falling equally in the middle. As I mentioned earlier, it is typically the direct uses which are easiest to quantify and place economic value on. Thus, the direct uses are correspondingly the most common and usually the most noted as having benefit to place value on for wildlife. But clearly, the public does have value for the indirect and non-use, although it's typically much more challenging to quantify and thus apply towards conservation value. This is the perspective of a representative population in the state, but it's worth noting that this result could change if you asked a smaller, different subgroup, like hunters or birders. But the reality is that most people are not hunters or birders, but that doesn't mean they don't receive benefit from wildlife being there. So for the last step in answering our question, can the public's perception be changed if they better understand the benefits? We used expert opinion to pair each of our 10 species with just one of the identified benefits. While it is absolutely true that each species may provide a multitude of benefits, we needed to simplify things for our purposes. We ended up listing the quail as a hunting species and the red cockaded woodpecker as a recreation species, given the likelihood that it may attract birders to want to see it. Pest control species were the rattlesnake, who eats smaller prey like rodents, and the evening bat, who consumes nighttime flying pests like mosquitoes. The benefit of supporting other animals in nature was attributed to the gopher tortoise, which is a keystone species in the longleaf ecosystem, providing burrows, which is home to over 300 other species, and the gopher frog, which benefits the ecosystem as prey at various stages in its life cycle. Lastly, the federally threatened indigo snake was associated with providing benefit for future generations, because if it goes extinct, future generations will never be able to admire it. The bald eagle was listed as a symbolic species, and the cute Sherman's fox squirrel and charismatic Florida black bear were associated with appreciation for just knowing they exist, a benefit often placed on cute and cuddly critters. We showed our survey participants each animal with their associated benefit, and then a new ranking screen listing each animal and their benefit together. And here were the results. At the high end of the ranking remained the bald eagle, with its ingrained symbolic value, regardless of the misconception that it is an endangered species. And now the gopher tortoise solidly ranks second, with further knowledge that it supports other animals in the ecosystem. The evening bat is the most surprised, which made the biggest leap to now being ranked third, with the new benefit of controlling pests that impact humans. Similarly, although the two snake species are still ranked at the bottom, the rattlesnake, which was also associated with the pest control benefit, has now switched places and is significantly higher than the indigo snake, which was associated with the future request value. The other species remained somewhat in the middle, although they did switch places. As you can see here, when we look at these results from the perspective of how each animal changed in their mean rank order from the original ranking before the benefits were introduced, from the last ranking after the benefits were paired, we can see some interesting results. In that all four of the species, tortoise, rattlesnake, frog, and bat, which were paired with the indirect uses of pest control or supporting other animals, were all the species who increased in their rank. While the animals associated with the non-uses, and especially the direct uses, were those who ended up declining. So after analyzing these results, we believe the answer to our question of whether the ecosystem services provided by wildlife can influence public support for conservation is yes. We also revealed that the indirect and non-use benefits are appreciated by the general public in Florida, likely even more so than the direct use benefits. So let's wrap up by mentioning a few take-home points. We determined that scientific information about wildlife-related ecosystem services significantly elevated public preference for habitat conservation, in particular for non-charismatic species that were previously unknown or disliked. We often rely on building support by pointing towards direct uses that generate direct revenue. But this study demonstrated it is also important to recognize the non-market values of wildlife, which people benefit from and appreciate. As a side note, I'll mention there was another aspect of this project that evaluated willingness to pay for habitat conservation of these same species. And in fact, the public was willing to pay a substantial amount to support habitat conservation, even for the species with indirect and non-use benefits. So, scientists among us should strive to continue identifying, measuring, and quantifying all potential perceived benefits of wildlife, as this information can be the magic bullet that managers, policymakers, and communicators can use to build support for their conservation actions. Overall, these findings exemplify the importance of how communicating information that has relevance to your audience can change their point of view. I hope I've inspired you to consider the eye of the beholder to change those beasts into beauties for the benefit of all. I appreciate support for this project provided by USDA NIFA, the School of Forest Resources and Conservation, and the Department of Wildlife, Ecology, and Conservation at the University of Florida. Please contact me via email for additional information or questions about the project. I would love to chat with you. Thank you very much.